In the 13th century, the Mongols invaded Rus and destroyed it, subjugated it, and during that time, the Lithuanians, a small Baltic tribe called the Lithuanians, in the 14th century started liberating the various principalities in what's now Belarus and Ukraine and parts of Western Russia from the Mongol yoke. And then in 1386, Lithuania and Poland combine forces. They unite and form one of the main powers of Europe at the time, which later became the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is its map. In the early 17th century, it was the major player in East Central Europe at the time. And you see Muscovy, or the Russian Tsardom, to the east in green, which was at the time a secondary player. But in time, of course, over the 17th century, Poland, Lithuania got weaker and weaker, and Muscovy got stronger, particularly after grabbing eastern Ukraine after the Cossack uprisings in the middle 17th century. So, long story short, towards the end of the 18th century, Poland, Lithuania is partitioned. Here you have a map of the partitions in the years 1772, 1793, and 1795. Russian land grabs are in green, and Russia captured about 2/3 of Polish territory at that point. And after the Napoleonic Wars, it also got central Poland, at that time holding about 80% of Polish territory. So the Poles were not happy about this, to say the least. And there were several major anti-Russian uprisings at the time. And here we have, well, the map of Europe in 1914, right on the brink of World War I. And Poland is obviously not on that map as a political entity. It's divided between Germany, Austria, and Russia. Here we have a Russian post-war territorial aspirations map from beginning of World War I, and it basically shows a trimmed down Germany and then enlarged Russia. And to some degree, this influenced white views of how they wanted to see the post-war European order had they won the civil war in Russia, because obviously wanted Poland to be part of an alliance with Russia, although not directly ruled by Russia, but they wanted to have very close alliances with Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. And throughout World War I, much of the fighting, it seesawed back and forth. Mostly much of the fighting on the Eastern Front occurred on Polish soil, so Poland was thoroughly devastated. During this time, the Russians did win some victories, but overall, the Germans and their mighty war machine eventually kept rolling the Russians eastward, and eventually the stress of the war was too much for Russia's military and economy. And so that led to the February Revolution in 1917. The Tsar, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, is compelled to abdicate the throne, and you have a provisional government being formed. And it was basically a coalition of classical liberals and moderate socialists. And many of these liberals and quite a few of the moderate socialists would later be part of the White Movement. Meanwhile, the Germans shipped Lenin and some other Bolshevik leaders from Switzerland to Russia on the SEAL train, with the goal of weakening and destabilizing that country from within. And because the provisional government was already quite weak, in October, November, depending on your calendar, in Russia it's the October Revolution, but in our calendar it falls in November 1917. The Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government in a coup, and the Civil War officially begins in Russia. Now, Lenin immediately decided to take Russia out of the war. He was looking for peace at any price. He wanted a so-called breathing spell, a periodishka in Russian, to consolidate the communist grip on power in the revolution. In his mind, the peace would be temporary anyway. He believed that the Allies and the Central Powers would basically destroy each other, and after that, communist revolution could spread in Europe and the world, and the Bolsheviks could basically pick up the pieces, reclaim the land anyway. And so the Bolsheviks eventually signed a peace with the Germans and the Austrians at Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. They gave up large swaths of land that included Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic lands, and Finland. And here you have a pretty decent map showing the extent of the losses. Territorially, it may not look as impressive as it did economically and in terms of population. Russia lost a lot of important, for example, the Donetsk Basin, and it lost a lot of population during that time. And as soon as the Bolsheviks took power, the white movement was born, both in opposition to their radicalism and the reign of terror that they immediately implemented against all political opponents, and the destabilization of the state that they immediately launched, as well as the whites were also opposed to the breaking of Russia's commitment to the Allies, because they viewed it as a question of honor, and they basically believed that the Bolsheviks had betrayed their allies, had sullied Russia's word, so to speak, sullied Russia's honor by taking Russia out of the war. They were also angry about the territorial concessions that Lenin had made to the Germans. And so throughout this whole period, the whites would see the Bolsheviks not just as revolutionaries in their own right, but also as tools of Germany, basically destabilizing tools of Germany. So for the whites, the fight against Bolshevism became interwoven with resisting Germany and halting the breakup of the empire, which of course put them at odds with the non-Russian nationalities, which wanted either autonomy or independence. At the same time, the whites are often depicted as reactionaries, wishing to restore the Tsarist monarchy, but they were actually a very diverse coalition from the moderate left, including moderate socialists, liberals of various stripes, nationalists, conservatives, monarchists, even fans of a republican system. So among the politicians leading the movement, liberals, classical liberals dominated, but among the officers, the generals, there was a more of a nationalist and monarchist sentiment. But either way, tremendous ideological diversity on the white side. Here are the main white leaders: Admiral Kolchak on the left, whose power base was in Siberia, and on the right you have General Anton Denikin, whose power base was in southern Russia, north of the Caucasus and the Cossack lands there. And one interesting fact is that he was actually half Polish. His mother was Polish, and he was born in Poland, in Russian Poland at the time. And now we get to November 1918, a very important turning point, because the Germans signed an armistice on November 11th. The war ends on the same day. Poland declared its independence, and immediately a long fight starts to establish frontiers and bring areas of Polish populations into the fold, because almost every frontier literally had to be fought for. So there was fighting with Germany, with the Ukrainians, with the Lithuanians, and of course the Bolsheviks. And Piłsudski, Joseph Piłsudski, became the head of state as well as the head of the military. He was a patriotic socialist. He was very anti-Russian. During the war, he had initially fought on the side of Germany and Austria, but in 1917, he rebelled and he was imprisoned at a German fortress. So he was freed. He returned to Warsaw and he immediately assumed the leadership of the country. And given that he had been a former anti-Tsarist revolutionary and that he hated Tsarist Russia, this would have very fateful consequences when it came to Poland's dealings with the whites at that point, because he saw them as just another bunch of reactionary generals wishing to restore Tsarism. Of course, we should remember that Piłsudski also saw the Bolsheviks as an imperialist Russian threat, especially since the Red Army at this time was moving westwards. They're moving towards Poland's borders, as quickly as the Germans were able to withdraw from those areas. And the goal was to spread communism. And so fighting between Polish and Bolshevik forces quickly began. So here we have a map showing late 1918 Soviet expansion, especially if you look at the western fringes, you see a gigantic offensive from basically from the Gulf of Finland all the way to the Black Sea, rolling westward towards Poland. So Poland began resisting, and so you have the Polish-Soviet War starts. And at the same time that you have a Polish-Soviet conflict, you have a white-red conflict in Russia. So the two conflicts are in so many ways linked. Here's a somewhat better, clearer map from the New York Times from early 1919 showing the fronts. So in the west, you have the Poles. In the south, you have the volunteer army, which was basically the white army under Denikin. And in the east, you see the Siberian forces, white Siberian forces under Admiral Kolchak. This is progress made by the Polish forces in the east. Slowly, little by little, throughout 1919, they pushed the Bolsheviks out of the eastern borderlands. They recaptured the city of Vilna. They took Minsk, and so Poland was in a pretty strong position around mid 1919, summer and fall of 1919. Now, in 1918 and early 1919, Poland was not really a primary interest to the whites. They had much more important priorities, primarily survival, hanging on, and when the situation at the front turned in their favor, hopefully defeating the Bolsheviks. So Poland was not a priority during the beginning. The whites did recognize Poland's independence. Many Poles, especially Piłsudski and his people, were very skeptical of this due to their very anti-Russian stance. And some historians to this day claim that the whites really refused to recognize Poland's independence, and this is a huge exaggeration. But nevertheless, these claims live on to this day in the commentary on these events. We should also note that Piłsudski's opponents on the right did have their reservation about the whites because they were Russians after all, but they were more willing to work with them because they viewed communism as a common threat. With the exception of Poland, the whites basically aspired to restore the Russian Empire in its pre-World War I borders, and they did, at least rhetorically, and they spoke about having a less centralized state than it was under the Tsars and giving the various nationalities greater autonomy. Although the various nationalities didn't really trust them, many wanted independence altogether. For example, the Ukrainian nationalists or the Georgian Republic or the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And the white slogan, which was Russia united and indivisible, really did little to bring these nationalities over to their side. For Piłsudski, there was a huge problem because what he wanted was a Polish-led anti-Russian alliance between the Baltic and the Black Sea. That would include especially Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic countries, even Finland, perhaps even Georgia and the Caucasus. That would restore Poland's sort of hegemony in East Central Europe that Poland had in the 17th century, for example. And when it came to the Polish offensive in the East, the whites were of two minds. On the one hand, they were happy that Poland was in the fight and it was kicking the Bolsheviks out of certain areas, but at the same time, they were distrustful because what they believed the Poles were doing was trying to capture quote unquote Russian lands. So this was definitely a major hurdle when it came to a Polish-Russian alliance, although I do think it's one that's easy to over-exaggerate because there was another hurdle. And that was the worldview itself of Josef Piłsudski. Like I mentioned before, he was raised in a romantic tradition of Polish uprisings against Russian rule. He was a socialist revolutionary, and he actively combated Russian domination and the Tsarist system. It's important to remember that even though he was a socialist, he prioritized independence. He put independence first, so that put him at odds with the internationalist wing of the socialist movement at that point, which later became the communist movement. And of course, he was not naive about the threat of the Bolsheviks, but to him, it was basically just another emanation of traditional Russian imperialism. And really, he believed that Russian Bolshevism was really Russian disease, and that it would not find fertile soil in Poland. So that was he didn't really think that the Bolsheviks they might invade Poland militarily, but he didn't think the ideology could really take root there by itself. Now let's look at the military situation as it was in the summer and fall 1919, which is much different than it was at the beginning of the year. If you look to the northwest, you see all the areas in green or light green. Those were held by Poland. You see the whites, who were in gray. This was at the peak of the Moscow offensive, when basically their forces were marching on Moscow, and they were getting closer and closer to Russia's former capital. And in between the Polish and white forces, you just have a salient, relatively small salient of land that was very exposed, jutting in between the two forces, and you have Ukrainian forces that were basically sandwiched in between everybody else. And during this time, the whites were trying to obtain Polish help, even when they were doing well on the front. One of the reasons they moved into Ukraine was actually to link up with Poland to obtain Allied aid through a direct land connection. Of course, there were other considerations as well. They wanted to snuff out Ukrainian nationalism and also claim the territory and its resources. And at the same time, under Allied pressure and to obtain intelligence, Piłsudski sent a military mission headed by General Karnitsky to the White headquarters in South Russia. The Whites were initially quite excited about this prospect. They viewed it as a prelude to an alliance. What Piłsudski really wanted was to primarily gather facts about the situation in Russia and to assess the military capabilities of both the Reds and the Whites. And in fact, this was in part because he actually he believed that potential military clash of the Whites was within the realm of possibilities in the near future. So he wanted to see, he really wanted to see firsthand the strength of the White forces. So those were the main reasons that the Karnitsky mission was sent. But the relations quickly reached an impasse. General Karnitsky's deputy insulted the Whites, and he had to be recalled, but the damage had been done. The Whites were hoping to obtain Polish aid without committing to any territorial concessions on the one hand, and Piłsudski in turn wanted to test them and see if they would agree to far-reaching concessions. And I would say it's difficult to speculate whether he believed they would even agree to such concessions or whether he was intentionally trying to sabotage these talks, although I suspect it was the latter. At the same time, Piłsudski's envoys were holding secret talks of the Bolsheviks. And this was going on from July of 1919 all the way till November. So this gave the Red Army a free hand. They were able to transfer like 43,000 troops to the anti-white front from the Polish front. And in spite of the secrecy of these talks, the white intelligence actually, I found in my dissertation, actually was aware of these talks. The Bolsheviks were desperate at this point, and they were willing to make very far-reaching concessions to the Poles. Mainly, they wanted a breathing spell like Brest-Litovsk, but their stance began to harden as soon as the Red Army started winning victories again. But in general, in the fall, Polish-white relations soured. The mission was essentially a failure. Polish troops stood still, and the whites got defeated by the Reds. At first, in October, November of the year, there were setbacks in the north. You see the map up top shows the maximum extent of white military progress at the time. The Reds counterattacked, but at first the whites were retreating in more or less good order. But then that increasingly turned into a disorganized rout. And so by December, January of 1920, they were basically pushed into the Black Sea, and Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, became like the last bastion of white resistance. Now, just to show you how desperate the Bolsheviks were in the summer and fall of 1919, when the whites were moving on Moscow, I have a quote here. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but basically this was a quote from October from the Polish delegate to the talks of the Reds, who basically said that a lot of the Soviet dignitaries were beginning to think about saving their own skins. They're starting to desert. Poland is their favorite destination. And basically a lot of the Bolsheviks were thinking of escaping to Poland. So the quote continues, it was clearly emphasized by the Bolsheviks that there will not be sufficient ammunition to fight a war on three fronts. The Bolsheviks identified as Poland's supposed alliance of Denikin, which of course never materialized with the Bolsheviks. This was their greatest nightmare at that point. Indeed, in mid-1920, top Bolshevik Karl Radek, who had actually been born in Poland, expressed little doubt that, quote, had the Poles attacked us when Yudenich stood only 6 versts away from Petrograd, Denikin was near Oryol, had the Poles taken Smolensk, Polotsk, and Vitebsk, and marched on Moscow, then we would have been defeated. I think that was an overall accurate assessment. Of course, not everyone agrees. A very prominent, respected historian in Poland, Andrzej Nowak, disagrees with that assessment. He believes that Poland was not in a position to help the whites, even if Piłsudski wanted to. However, even he agrees that had there been a Polish offensive, then that would have at least allowed the whites to escape a total rout. They would have lost some territory, but they wouldn't have necessarily been pushed into the Black Sea altogether. There is evidence that Piłsudski was considering an offensive if the white situation goes sour quickly enough. His main point was if Poltava, the city of Poltava, which is in eastern Ukraine, if that falls to the Bolsheviks, then he was thinking that Poland should act, but his generals convinced him that this was a bad idea. And so in any case, at that point, the situation was deteriorating very fast anyway. Now, the conservative anti-communist writer, Józef Mackiewicz, in his 1962 novel, The Victor Provocation, described the reasoning behind the failure to offer help to the whites as, quote unquote, stubbornness in the realm of national interests, the combination of national radicalism, of social radicalism, which promoted a general attitude towards Bolshevism as a lesser evil, which can be used to combat a neighboring type of nationalism. And again, I would say that is a fairly accurate assessment. Now, of course, there were plenty of voices that defended Piłsudski's decision, and their argument largely boiled down to the claim that had the whites won, that would have led perhaps even to a war of Poland or a conflict of Poland. And as evidence, they usually pointed to white territorial claims as evidence. Although, again, I would argue that as far as white territorial claims were concerned, there was as much bark as there was bite in them, although perhaps even more bark than bite. Marian Zdechowski, who was a very well-known scholar and philosopher, very respected in interwar Poland, and who had actually known Leo Tolstoy fairly well. He had visited him at his estate in Yasnaya Polyana, argued that, on the contrary, so we should have ignored this talk and done our own thing, i.e., to take over the eastern lands and simultaneously support the white armies. According to Zdechowski, the question arises whether Denikin, having captured Moscow thanks to Polish help, would have immediately, as some claim, attacked Poland to reclaim what Russia considers quote-unquote eternally Russian lands. The answer is no, Zdechowski continues. He would not have been able to do so. Even if he wanted to, he would have been compelled to deal with much more urgent, burning matters. The Bolsheviks, having conquered Russia, exterminated the intelligentsia while intimidating the rest of the population through terror, rendering it incapable of resistance. Therefore, Denikin or anyone else in his place would have a lot of work beyond his strength to accomplish after ousting the Bolsheviks, beginning with mopping up the surviving elements of the Cheka, dispersing the Bolshevik bureaucracy, and ending with the reorganization of the state. Where would he find the people for all these tasks? Asked Zdechowski rhetorically. And I use this quote because it really sums up the problem of the whites had they managed to overthrow the Bolsheviks. Russia was devastated. Millions of people had been killed. The economy was wrecked. And so the peasantry was up in arms. The peasantry was really opposed to both the Reds and the Whites, and they were 80% of the country. Many of the non-Russian nationalities also were in rebellion. So the Whites would have really not been in a position to fight against any external opponent at that point. So in conclusion, although the whites had numerous factors that undermined their own efforts, such as their own nationality policy or imperial rhetoric that we mentioned, it's likely that Polish aid in 1919 could have helped them defeat the Bolsheviks. In 1920, although the whites were still fighting in the Crimea under Wrangel, Poland would essentially have to face the brunt of a significantly stronger and larger Red Army alone. In fact, it came very close to losing its independence altogether and becoming a Soviet republic, since the Bolsheviks got all the way to Warsaw in a huge offensive after Poland had been unable to help liberate Ukraine with its Ukrainian allies earlier that year. However, I would say even in late 1920, there were some hopes that had Poland and the Ukrainians been able to cooperate with Wrangel, with the whites in Crimea, that they could have undermined the Bolsheviks. But the situation was much more difficult and complicated because, again, the Reds were much stronger at that point than they had been in 1919. Ultimately, it's impossible to tell how Russian relations would have developed had the whites won, but we know what occurred in the Soviet Union. Communism was brutally imposed, and even the large Polish diaspora in the Soviet Union faced genocide in the late 1930s under Stalin. There's literature in Poland on this very topic. It's called the Polish Operation of the NKVD. And of course, World War II began with the Soviet Union carving up Poland with Germany. Of course, that was the main nightmare scenario in Poland altogether. Germany and Russia working together against them, and some Poles, including Piłsudski, thought that the whites would form an alliance with Germany and carve up Poland. But in fact, Bolsheviks or the Soviets did that in 1939. So Hitler and Stalin carved up Poland. That began World War II. And after the war, Poland basically spent half a century imprisoned as a satellite within the Soviet bloc. So Piłsudski's greatest fears, ironically, about the whites paradoxically came true under the Red Banner. Thank you very much. And I am ready for any questions if anyone has them.
Hi, sir. We have a few questions already.
Sure.
I will start by reading them off. The first one, is there any account of how collectivism among the whites affected the control of information across the fronts during the conflicts? Were there any fronts or key points that were affected by the false information being spread?
Well, collectivism, I mean, the whites were, are we talking ideologically or are we talking about misinformation? I'm not sure I fully grasp the question, but you know, the main collectivists in the conflict were, of course, the Bolsheviks, because their ideology, you could say, was ultra collectivistic. It was totalitarian Marxism, and the whites, well, they had moderate socialist elements. They had nationalists. You could say they had imperialists. You could say that there were elements of collectivism in their ideology. Um, but other than that, I'm not sure what the questioner meant by collectivism.
Okay. The other question we had was, what attempts at stopping the spread of misinformation that lead to the diversion of the attention from the Bolsheviks to the alternate party were used, if known? Are there any examples of telegraph or communications that were used on radio or program campaigns for this diversion tactic?
Well, I mean, as far as misinformation goes, again, I would need some clarification of what the questioner means by disinformation. I think there was certainly disinformation or misinformation as far as who the whites were or what their intentions were, although there was some grain of truth to it also. Definitely, I would say that some of the claims made then already, 1918, 1919, that the whites opposed Polish independence altogether, I would say that was definitely misinformation. Um, and it was spread, well, every which way, including the press and by word of mouth, and many Polish politicians, especially Piłsudski, believed that. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
Okay, one of the next
yeah.
questions we have is, did Joseph Piłsudski ever issue a single definitive public statement unequivocally stating he should or should not have intervened in Russia?
Well, so there were certainly he was certainly quoted as making statements when he was speaking with, you know, like, for example, Russian anti-communists or other interlocutors, uh, where he basically called the whites reactionaries, and there were even quotes of him saying that they're worse than the Bolsheviks. But really, the people who he didn't really defend his his decision as much as his supporters and some of the generals that served under him did later on, especially during the 1930s. And so it was his supporters that were really stressing that argument more than he did.
Okay, and following up on that question, would a part of um, Pilsudski's calculus simply be the lack of confidence in his own military capability or capacity at that point in history?
Yes and no. Yes, because to some degree, the Polish military was not as strong as 1919 as it was in 1920. Um, Although at the same time, the Red Army was definitely not as strong at that point either, and it had to divert a lot of its forces to fight the whites. So probably, I would say, ironically, the Polish forces had a better chance to push back the Bolsheviks on their own front in 1919 than in 1920, because they just would face a part of the Bolshevik military which was weaker than it was in 1920. Um, Now, while Piłsudski understood that the Polish army needed a lot of supplies and a lot of equipment, at the same time he was confident. Uh, he made statements as to to the effect that, well, the Polish military is extremely powerful, and the whites are very weak, and the Russians are very weak, and there's nothing they can do to us. So one can argue this both ways. And of course, Piłsudski was a quite complicated individual, so it's possible he entertained both ideas at the same time.
Wonderful. Our next question is, what was the political / social situation in Poland at the time of a potential Polish intervention? The Polish population was willing to defend their homeland, but was their willpower to fight beyond historical Polish borders, considering the war had been going on for nearly 6 years at that point?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Public opinion was definitely a part of the story. There was well, number one, there was a lot of anti-Russian sentiment in Poland altogether, because of the partitions, 150 years of Russian rule, which was often quite ham-fisted and even brutal. So yes, especially on the left among the socialists, but in fact, even among the nationalists and the conservatives, there was anti-Russian sentiment. So yes, there was definitely quite a bit of opposition to maybe getting involved in the Russian Civil War. And yes, the population wanted peace. But at the same time, Piłsudski was a very strong personality. So had he wanted to get involved, he probably would have. For example, in the spring of 1920, he faced a population that wanted peace, but he believed that the Bolsheviks were going to make the first move. So he struck an alliance with the Ukrainians and he captured Kiev, even though he understood that there was quite a lot of anti-war sentiment in the country. So yes, that's definitely a part of the equation there, but it wasn't it wasn't the decisive factor, I would say.
And one of the next questions is, how would you think the UPR would position itself in a theoretical Polish-White alliance?
Well, that's another issue. I mean, the UPR was the Ukrainian People's Republic was very weak at this point. It had been sort of pushed into a corner, and you know, it would have been a really tough position, because the whites considered the UPR an enemy. Piłsudski considered the UPR a friend. So definitely, probably Piłsudski would have had to jettison the UPR, kind of abandon them to form an alliance with the whites. And he really didn't want to do that, even in November of 1919, when he was having negotiations with Lenin, and Lenin was sort of dismissive of the UPR, and that made Piłsudski very angry. So definitely, the Ukrainian part of the equation was definitely important and would have been a complicating factor here. That's for sure.
Wonderful, thank you, sir. We have a couple more questions. So, what is Piłsudski's reputation in Poland today? Is he generally viewed in positive or negative terms?
Well, generally in positive terms, yes. I mean, he was the leader of the country before World War II. He took power in 1926. He was, I don't want to use the term authoritarian, but he was definitely the strong man in the country. And even when he died, 1935, his successors ruled the country, so they were able to shape public opinion. And because of the victory at Warsaw in 1920, he was instrumental in that. A lot of Poles, he was popular among a lot of Polish society, although not the nationalist and conservative elements, of course, were opposed to him. But I would say that, ironically, he became even more popular after World War II, when Poland was under Soviet communist rule. He sort of became, because of the victory at Warsaw in 1920, he became sort of the symbol of anti-Russian, anti-communism. And so now he's definitely most Poles are probably Piłsudskiites in one way or another. I would say even on the right, the Law and Justice Party, the Conservative Party in Poland is definitely invokes Piłsudski, and definitely they respect his legacy and invoke his legacy a great deal. And if you ask the average Pole, they will definitely respect Piłsudski and admire him.
Wonderful. One of our next questions is, due to the diverse nature of white Russia, even if they had quote unquote defeated Bolshevik forces in 1920, would they have been able to hold on to power, or would Bolshevik forces have reunited?
Yeah, so it's possible that's a very good question, because capturing Moscow and Petrograd would not have been the end of the story. Probably that would have been the beginning of the end for the Bolsheviks. There probably would have been a Bolshevik insurgency, maybe guerrilla warfare, especially in the cities. There probably would have been some, perhaps Bolshevik terrorism. So the whites would have had to cope with that. I think the bigger problem for them would have been in the villages where, like I said, 80% of the country was peasant, and the peasants sort of wanted their own freedom. They really didn't like either the Bolsheviks or the whites, and there probably would have been definitely peasant insurgencies under the banner of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which was the main peasant party. So definitely the whites would have definitely had, I believe there would have still been some fighting and mopping up operation for years to come.
Thank you. We have a longer question box. I'm going to break it up into a couple. The first one is, can there be a comparative to the current tensions with Russia and Poland, as another party has entered the issue that you feel comfortable speaking on?
Well, so as far as the current conflict of Ukraine, I'd rather stick to the history of 1919, 1920. I don't want to be making statements as far as the Ukraine conflict is concerned.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And then, could Poland's previous loss of this conflict be tracked in the current conflict involving other parties that need assistance, communications, routes, misinformation campaigns, or intelligence gathering that has been documented so far?
Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm following the question.
What, if the person who wrote the question, if you would like to give a little bit more of information in the comment section, I can ask it from there.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
He said understandable. Thank you. Perfect. If there are any other questions, please. Oh, perfect. We have another one. And then please use the Q&A box as well. The next one was, Piłsudski ever considering also propping up a Belarus state like he attempted with the Ukrainians?
He did. He definitely did. Belarus was sort of if you look at the map, the Baltic states are one wing of the sort of anti-Russian buffer zone. Ukraine was the other wing, and Belarus is there right in the middle, sort of at its heart. So he definitely wanted a Belarus allied with Poland, except the Belarusians. I would say this: the Ukrainians were divided into a lot of different factions, but the Belarusians were even more divided. So he was cultivating factions that were pro-Polish, but you had factions that were pro-Lithuanian, pro-Russian, pro-German. A lot of those factions were against Polish rule, and there was also a lot of pro-Russian sentiment in Belarus, even to the point where sometimes that Belarusian sentiment masked pro-Russian sentiment. Whereas in Ukraine, things were a lot simpler. Although there was a lot of resistance to alliance with Poland too, among the various Ukrainian factions. But once the Reds really emerged as the main winners in the conflict in early 1920, the Ukrainians felt like they had no other choice, so they allied with the Poles. In Belarus, the situation was a bit different than in Ukraine.
Thank you. The next question was, were the Cheka involved in undermining Polish support for the whites?
Uh, well, I haven't really looked into that in detail. Obviously, there were Bolshevik couriers and there were underground communists and pro-communist agents in Poland who were indeed trying to undermine any Polish support for the whites, which overall was not that hard, given that a lot of Polish society was anti-Russian. Um, a lot of the sort of pro-communist agents of influence would have been especially targeting the Socialist Party and the left wing of the Polish peasant movement. Um, as far as undermining the support for the whites. But on the right side, on the center right side, they would have been much less successful in that regard, I think.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was our final question.
Thank you.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Palestrina, our sponsors, and all of you who joined us today. For those interested in learning more about our courses and applying to study at IWP, please speak with a member of our staff at the conclusion of today's event or visit us online at iwp.edu. Lastly, we hope you all will save the date for IWP's 35th anniversary gala on Thursday, October 9th at the National Portrait Gallery. Tickets and sponsorship options are now available on our website at iwp.edu/gala. The deadline did just extend to September 28th, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.